Welcome to English 111, Introduction to Poetry. Study Session 1, Nature and Origin of Poetry. Introduction. In this study session, you will be introduced to various definitions of poetry, which will give you immense insight into the nature of poetry. After that, you will be shown possible origins of poetry. You will also study about the distinguishing characteristics of poetry, certain elements a poem must possess, alongside practical ways you can successfully appreciate a poem. Learning outcomes for study session 1. When you have studied this session, you should be able to create your own definition of poetry. Discuss the origin of poetry. What poetry is. Let me begin with a part quotation from one of the many existing definitions of poetry, this time by a famous English poet and critic, William Wordsworth. He defined poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. The uniqueness of human experience is largely responsible for the often controversial responses or reactions to poetry. What should be of concern to you as a student of poetry or me as a teacher of poetry, however, is the dimension of the controversy and its effects on both students and teachers of poetry. Definitions of poetry. Poetry means different things to different people. Carefully study the following excerpts from different attempts by some great poets and critics at the definition of poetry. They certainly will explain further the import of this statement. Poetry is 1. The power to define the undefinable in terms of the unforgettable. Lewis Untermeyer and Carter Davidson in poetry. Its appreciation and enjoyment. New York, 1934. 2. The music of the soul, and above all of great and of feeling souls. One merit of poetry few persons would deny. It says more in fewer words than prose. Voltaire. In Poets, a Philosophical Dictionary, trans. William F. Fleming. New York, 1901. 3. Simply the art of electrifying language with extraordinary meaning. Lascelles, Abercrombie, The Theory of Poetry. New York, 1926. 4. Simply the most beautiful, impressive, and widely effective mode of saying things. Matthew Arnold. Heinrich Heine. Essays in Criticism. First series. London, 1921. London, 1921. 5. Transfiguration. The transfiguration of the actual or the real into the ideal at a lofty elevation through the medium of melodious or nobly sounding verse. Alfred Austin. The growing distaste for the higher kinds of poetry. Fortnightly Review. N.S. March 1904. 6. A comforting piece of fiction set to more or less lascivious music. A slap on the back in world's time. A grand release of longing and repressions to the tune of flute, harps, sackbuts, psalteries, and the usual strings. H. L. Mencken. Prejudices. Third series. New York, 1922. 7. The art of uniting pleasure with truth by calling imagination to the help of reason. Samuel Johnson, John Milton, Lives of the English Poets, London and New York, 1958. 8. The Lava of the Imagination Whose Eruption Prevents an Earthquake, George Gordon, Lord Byron, Letters and Journals, Roland E. Prothero, London, 1922. 9. Man is Rebellion Against Being What He Is, James Branch, Cabell, Jongen, New York, 1927. 10. Poetry comes with anger, hunger and dismay. It does not often visit groups of citizens sitting down to be literally together, and would appall them if it did. Christopher Morley, John Mistleto, Garden City, New York, 1931. 11. I wish our clever young poets would remember my homely definitions of prose and poetry. That is, prose equals words on their best order. Poetry equals best word in the best order. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, The Table Talk and Omniana of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, T. Ash, London, 1896. 12. The business of words in prose is primarily to state. In poetry, not only to state, but also and sometimes primarily to suggest. John Livingstone Lowes, Convention and Revolt in Poetry, Boston and New York, 1919. 13. Perhaps no person can be a poet or can even enjoy poetry without a certain unsoundness of mind. By poetry, we mean the art of employing word in such a manner as to produce an illusion on the imagination, the art of doing by means of words what the painter does by means of colors. Thomas Babington Macaulay, Milton, Essays and Biographies, London, 1906. 14. I could add that in Africa poetry is our very essence, our being and life. It is our day-to-day interaction with one another. It is our music and dance, the prayers of the traumatized, the pain of the pauperized. It is the cries of abandoned babies, the aroma of our cuisine, the birds and their songs, the goats and their bleating, the glamour of our environmental decay, our democracy and its casualties. Ademola da Silva. Reflection. The list is above is inexhaustible. Can you attempt creating your own definition of poetry? Possible sources of poetry. Although it may not be easy in determining how long poetry has existed, one may just as well be contented with simply tracing the likely sources that have given birth to poetry in general. Nature possesses distinct orderliness, birth and death, night and day. The sun, the moon, and the stars give their natural light or blackout at determined time, peace and space. The planets revolve at a terrific precision around their orbits round the sun. The earth too rotates on its axis with similar speed and precision and simultaneously revolves around the sun or its orbit. The orderliness or the observable precision I have described above are as real as they are poetic. Naturally, they in turn provoke poetry. Reflection. Have you ever witnessed a time that day failed to break, perhaps for 48 hours, or that Earth bumped into Mars in its orbit, or that it rains and yet nothing grows, or that reproduction of living things generally stopped. Similarly, the relationship between man and man, woman, or the interaction between man and nature quite often leads to some experience or specific human feelings, such as, for example, joy, sorrow, laughter, disillusionment, etc. These intense human feelings, when expressed in words, could be poetic. For example, man's interaction with nature gave rise to his acknowledgement of a supreme being, or God, or gods and goddesses, believed to be capable of assisting him in any helpless or hopeless situation. That was the beginning of religious worship. In such worship, the greatness, the enduring mercy, the omnipotence, and the omniscience of the supreme deity are celebrated. This is done with a touch of hyper-exaggeration, and over-exaggeration is a common feature of poetry. For example, in Yoruba praise worship of the supreme deity, referred to as Olorun, from Olu Orun, meaning the ruler, creator, owner of the heavens of heaven, or Olodumare, ruler, creator, owner of the universe, to whom I must return. It is in this regard, among others, that God is referred to as Eleti Gbaroye, he whose heirs are meant to receive all complaints. Something close to this is observed in the next example, which gives the impression of some being with a pair of ears the size of a giant satellite dish, a typical over-exaggeration. Eleti Gborogodo, he whose ears are extremely large. Olowo Gbogboro, he who possesses extremely long hands. Ogbagba tí ń gbára àdúgbò, deliverer who protects our neighbors. In the same vein, certain historical figures who were elevated to the pedestal of deities or demigods by virtue of what the people believed were unparalleled achievements or contributions to their respective societies have found their ways into indigenous praise poetry and or heroic chants and epic poems. ITQ sport exaggeration in this Pentecostal Christian praise song. Ẹ má bá mi ra bàbà fọ́ba ògo, prostrate in praise of the King of Glory. Ọba tẹ́rẹ̀rẹ̀ kárí ayé, one whose sprawling size covers the whole earth. ITE, the designation of the Almighty as one whose sprawling size covers the whole earth, is clearly an exaggeration. Man, regardless of his geographical location or color pigmentation, is naturally an animist, and as such tends to react or respond to some natural phenomenon the same way. Some Shakespearean plays or D.O. Fagunwa's novels, among others, are eloquent testimony in this regard. Although through science and modern technology, he has successfully cleared some of the mist, the residue of the old belief in the existence of spirits or supernatural forces is still very much with the indigenous African society. Man's interaction with nature and subsequent awareness of his limitations led to his quest into the possibility of applying metaphysical means, including the power of the spoken word, as coping strategy to subdue as well as control some of the nature elements for the purpose of serving his needs. The metaphysical powers are otherwise called magic. Incantations are imbued with magical potency. Examples of incantatory poetry can be found in A. The encounter between Odewale and Oba Adetusa in Olarotimi's The Gods Are Not to Blame. Odewale: what are these before my eyes? Are they mountains or are they trees? They are human beings and not trees. They are human beings and not mountains. For trees have no eyes. Then let these eyes around me close. Close, close in sleep, close in sleep. That is my word. The mountain always sleeps. Sleep, 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 sleep till the sun goes to sleep. And B, when a strainer takes in water, all the water immediately goes out of it. When a weaker fish trap takes in water, all the water immediately goes out of it. The drake cannot, even in a fit of anger, crow. Origin leave commands you to forgive me, no matter what I may have done amiss. Translated by Olabimton in Senanu and Vincent's A Selection of African Poetry. Poetry in this regard is perceived in the use of over-exaggeration, hyperbole, repetition and anaphora, imagery, use of negative or positive correlates, and rapidity of delivery. In the case of incantation, in institutional mediation, poetry arises from the effects of social life. For example, songs to celebrate the arrival of a new baby, wedding songs, elegiac songs, and dirges to mark the departure to the great beyond of a beloved, religious hymns, chants celebrating courage or mocking human fables, all handed down orally from one generation to another. Traditional chanters, palace minstrels, or griots, poets, among others, were at liberty to employ their skills to pull down their society or assist in lifting it up. See Niyi Osundari's A Dialogue of the Drum. Poetry becomes especially localized as an art expressed verbally. Language, it must be emphasized, is a cultural production. Similarly, poetry subsists in expressed words, spoken or written. By implication, certain developments become perceivable, such as increased capacity for mental retention of poetry. Refreshing poetry as a specialized verbal art, as well as sophisticating its many aspects. The development of poetry became more enhanced with the arrival of printing technology. One of such areas of development is the separation into oral and written poetry. Oral poetry still retains its spontaneity and uniqueness. Written poetry now becomes more specialized and formalized, and except in few cases as in Okot's P. Bitek song of Lawino and Song of Okol, Okimba, Lonko's Ire and other poems for performance, or Ademola da Silva's songs of Odamolugbe, in which the poets consciously retain the orality, the original aesthetics and form of the indigenous African oral poetry, while the topicality engages contemporary issues. An example from Ademola da Silva's songs of Odamolugbe: the O nips at Mother Earth, like a blowing wind, my mercuric song reveals the naked anus of the foul-feigned god. Kange Kange, my song from the broken song, barren of Osundare, pastoral images, the untiring Odamolugbe himself, lingering lyrics of Olosunta Yesta laws, wig-wagging laws, whipping delinquent adults who add salt to our noon sauce. Singers of law incapable of weaving songs into fighting spirits should observe, learned from my master, the Odamolugbe himself. A drummer with a drum does not beat his belly instead. My song, devoid of Shoyinka's verbal smithing, the rhythmic stir-up of Ogun metallic. ITQ spot an element of orality in the above poem. ITA The onomatopoeic word kange kange mimics the sound of a song. Poetry appreciation. The first step in the appreciation of poetry is to learn to read a poem correctly, with every word pronounced correctly and aloud. If you cannot do this, learn to read it attentively so as to hear the sounds of its words in your inner ear. The second step is to bear in mind always that some poems are simple, some complex, but no good poem yields all its meaning easily or at once. A good poem has to be read repeatedly before it can be fully appreciated. Note also the following. Do not start by worrying about the meaning of a poem. Begin by appreciating its sounds, noting the variety of sound repetitions. Move on to know the meanings of the words used in the poem and to determine whether the words have been used denotatively or connotatively. Identify the figures of speech, the rhetorical devices used, and their meanings. Then try to determine who the speaker in the poem is, what is or a situation, and what tone does he or she use. Go over the poem again and again and again and again, and by this time, a meaning of the poem will have suggested itself to your mind. In fact, you will have arrived at the meaning without realizing it. Distinguishing characteristics of poetry. What distinguishes poetry from other forms of literature besides the characteristic economy of words is its exploitation of the resources of language and music. In other words, the distinguishing features of poetry are both intrinsic. The exploitation is intense, more frequent, and more discriminate than we have in other forms of literature. A. Poetry and resources of language. Diction. Comment 12. Diction, the choice of words as devised by a particular poet, novelist, etc. Until recent times, the uniqueness of poetry was linked with its specialized use of poetic diction. In the light of this, some words are considered more poetic than others, and poets naturally prefer such poetic words to commonplace words. We must emphasize, however, that there is a thin difference between the language of prose and that of poetry. A casual reading of the first few pages of Wole Soyinka's The Interpreters, a novel, will definitely prove this. What is important is how best words are put to use. A good poet finds the best words to effect the best expression. The tendency, however, is for a poet to prefer a choice of words that are imaginative and more figurative than a writer of, for example, prose fiction. Consider some lines in Okot P. Bitek's Song of Lawino. When the sun has grown up and the poison tips of its arrows painfully bite the backs of the men hoeing and of the women weeding or harvesting. Or Christopher Okibo's Idoto. Before you, Mother Idoto, naked I stand, before your watery presence, a prodigal. The passage 3. 1. Denotation. It is the primary meaning of a word that is called its denotative meaning. For example, there is a rat in the room. In this context, the animal rat is unwanted in the room and may constitute a health hazard. 2. Connotation. It refers to the secondary meaning of a word, its symbolic meaning. Example, there is a rat in this room. At the secondary or symbolic level, the meaning of rat transcends the mere animal. It suggests that a traitor is in the room. The implication is that they must be more careful about what they say or do. ITQ. Give the denotation meaning and the possible connotative meaning of the following. The pot that desires the taste of soup must surrender itself to the fire. Yoruba proverb. ITA, denotative meaning. A pot must be heated before it can contain soup. Possible connotative meaning. One must endure hardship to be refined, successful, etc. 3. Imagery. This is often used interchangeably with figurative language or figures of speech. It is the concretization of what otherwise could have been a mere abstraction in a way that gives sense experience. Our sense or mental response makes imagery possible. Imagery, therefore, evokes concrete mental images, which in turn inform our emotional or intellectual response. We must emphasize too that while imagery makes use of images, not all images qualify as imagery. For example, compare the two statements below. 1a. I have been to Bodija market before. It was rowdy and stank terribly. 1b. I have been to Bodija market before. It was a ranch of disorderly cattle. The odor hit one right in the face like the fist of some deadly boxer. In 1a, the statement is straightforward. The image or picture suggested is that of a disorderly and stinking market. In 1b, the statement has not expressed anything less. In addition to this, however, the statement also evokes some mental pictures that make the speaker's experience more enduring in the mind of his audience. The image of disorderliness among a herd of cattle in a ranch suggests the rowdiness of the people. A ranch, in this context, is suggestive of a market that is more suited for animals, cattle, than human beings. Disorderly cattle and ranch are used metaphorically. Similarly, the stinking odor merely stank in sentence 1a. Now, assumes the picture of a human being, a boxer, the punches of whom are mischievous and deadly. The idea of filthy odor eating one is a personification, and since the fist blow is likened to that of a boxer, it is a simile. Since imagery contributes significantly to poetry, I shall give it further attention under figures of speech in order to help your understanding. 4. Figurative language. This has to do with some relationship between that which is said and that which is non-literal language. The relationship is at different levels. A. Simile. It involves a physical or emotional similarity between a given image and what is intended. In other words, it is an expressed comparison between two unlike things in which like or as or any other similar expression is used. I must emphasize, however, that it is not every statement where like or as occurs that qualifies as a simile. Hence, the emphasis on two unlike things in the subjective or the objective. For example, 2a. Olugbenga plays football like Angulu. 2b. Ansem plays football like a bull. 2c. Karim is as good as where on the football pitch. In 2a, Olugbenga and Angulu are two like, similar personages. Therefore, the statement does not qualify for a simile. In 2c, Karim and George Weah, the Liberian footballer who was declared the World Footballer of the Year 1995-96, are two unlike personages. The international weight of Weah makes it possible for this comparison to be a simile. Similarly, in 2b, Anselm and a bull are two unlike entities. Hence, the statement simply suggests that Anselm is a very rough or aggressive footballer whose manner of playing gives one the mental picture of a bull on the field of play. Therefore, it qualifies as a simile. Other examples of simile are 2d, except that like some fish doped out of the deep, I have bobbed up belly-wise from stream of sleep, and no cockcrow, J.P. Clark, Night Rain. Clark likens a deep sleep to a stream of flowing river. The poet compares the discomfort of a sudden waking from a deep sleep and the attendant fear and surprise with the shocking fear of a fish caught with a hook or the net and forcefully drawn out from the deep of the sea onto an open, waterless space, panting for life. Also in the same poem, Night Rain. (2e) Great water drops are dribbling, falling like orange or mango, fruits showered forth in the wind, or perhaps I should say so. Much like beads are cooled in prayer tell, them on string as they break, in wooden bowls and earthenware. The thickness, heaviness, or intensity of the raindrops which fall on the rooftop under the impact of powerful wind is likened to the effect of orange or mango fruits dropping, and the regular intervals or pace at which the raindrops drop into wooden bowls and earthenware. The poet compares with the pace at which prayers are said on the rosary or the tesbih. Epic simile is a type of simile. However, unlike normal or usual simile, the reference is not only drawn from classical events, figures, elements, etc., but forms a good basis for digressions, giving detailed information, clarification about the referent. For example, John Milton draws a parallel similarity between the striking beauty of Eve immediately after leaving Adam's side to walk separately and that of a Greek goddess, thus saying, "From her husband's hand her hand sought she withdrew, and like a wood nymph light, dread or dryad, or of the lyre's strain, betook her to the groves, but the lyre's self in gait surpassed and goddess like the port, though not as she with bow and quiver armed, but with such gardening tools as art yet rude, guiltless of fire, had formed, or angels brought." John Milton, Paradise Lost. B. Metaphor. In this case, the comparison between the two unlike things are implied. Remember that in simile, it is an expressed comparison. In metaphor, it is an implied or compressed comparison. Often, it is difficult to recognize a metaphor. For example, 3A. Chigozie is a bull on the field. Metaphor. B. Olusegun plays football like a bull. Simile. 4A. The angry man butchered his helpless wife. Metaphor. 4B. The angry man killed his helpless wife as one butchers a cow. Simile. No doubt, the example given in 3A may appear quite unusual since the most common ones are derived from nouns. For example, a bull, etc. However, the verb butchered, no doubt, is a verb that conjures a mental picture of an abattoir scene where a butcher runs his knife through the throat of a cow and finally cuts the cow into pieces. Extended metaphor is a reference that involves not only a one-to-one comparison, but which provides for the purpose of clarification, provides more information about the referent. Example, but it's a common proof that lowliness is young ambition's ladder, whereto the climber upward turns his face, but when he once attains the upmost round, he then unto the ladder turns his back. Looks in the clouds, scorning the base degrees by which he did ascend. William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. C. Personification. In this literary device, human attributes are given to abstractions, inanimate objects, and non-human beings. In other words, it is transferring personal qualities to a non-person. It is therefore a misapplication of term to talk of personification where real living human characters are the points of reference. This is so because human characters are understandably persons already. However, where or when a poet chooses to give anything other than a living person the attributes of a human being, he makes a person of it. That is personification. Very close to personification is apostrophe. Examples of personification. 5.1. The cold and monstrous hands of death snatched my love. 5.2. The trees in the forest opened their boughs attentively to our tired, helpless wailing. 5.3. In those days, when civilization kicked us in the face, when holy water slapped our cringing brows, our emphasis, David Diop, The Vultures, line 1 to 3. Civilization, holy water, and brows are personified in the above examples. 4. The ripest fruit was saddest. Wole Soyinka Abiku, line 29. 5. Oh, conspiracies, seek not to hide your face. Julius Caesar, Brutus, addressing the conspirators in one their nocturnal meetings. 5.6. Love is gentle, meek, and kind. Love does not loathe to anger. 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 to 8. D. Apostrophe. In apostrophe, a character or the poetic voice, persona, addresses directly an inanimate object or an abstraction as one would a living human being. The direct address could be to a dead person, as Antony addresses the body of Julius Caesar in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. 1. Antony, O mighty Caesar, dost thou lie so low? Are all thy conquests, glories, triumphs, spoils shrunk to this little measure? Fare thee well. 2. Antonio, Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth, that I am meek and gentle with these butchers. Thou art the ruins of the noblest man that ever lived in the tide of times. Woe to the hand that shed this costly blood. Over thy wounds now do I prophesy, which like dumb mouths do open their rubby lips, to beg the voice and utterance of my tongue. William Shakespeare, Julius Caesar. Or the biblical David to the slain bodies of Jonathan and King Saul, as if they were alive, except from Lament of the Bow by King David. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad. Lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished. 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 19 to 20, 25 to 27. NIV Topical Study Bible, page 324. Such addresses may also be directed to someone who is not at the scene of an event but addressed as if he were present. E. Allusion. This is an implicit or explicit reference to persons, places, things, or events with historical or mythological significance. It can be reference drawn from the Bible, the Quran, the Ifa corpus, or any classical literature of a given culture, Greek, Oriental, African, etc. Allusion can be considered on three levels. 1. Classical allusion, a reference to a person, place, thing, or an event in the ancient classical Greek, Oriental, or African culture. Example: A. You are the Helen causing the cities in my head to be at war with passion. Preference is made to Helen, the classical beauty queen that was said to be the cause of the sporadic wars between the Greek and the Trojans. The two cities, Greece and Troy, had contested for the possession of the controversial queen. B. Like the 7 children of the legendary Oduduwa, your princes have launched out to find new literary kingdoms for themselves, a reference to Oduduwa and the 7 children. Oduduwa is believed to be the father of the Yoruba race. His 7 children were believed to have founded 7 notable Yoruba towns. 2. Historical allusion, reference to person, place, thing, or an event in the contemporary history. For example, A. If General Abacha's rule was characterized by a tsunami of extrajudicial killings, President of Obasanjo's 8 years of democratic rule revealed a country submerged under a Katrina of institutionalized corruption in high places. Relevant to contemporary Nigerian political development. Can you suggest other relevant examples? 3. Biblical or Quranic allusion, reference to person, place, thing, or an event in either the Bible or the Quran. Can you identify any such allusion in the passage below? Most African countries today constitute the modern Babylon. The deluge of poverty drowns and drags away the people into perdition, leaving a few self-seeking opportunists in the ark afloat. A.O. da Silva, a rudderless state ship. F. Apposition. It is an additional statement or words to a preceding word for the purpose of clarification or explanation. Example, mother has dipped 3 fingers of her left hand, thumb, forefinger, and middle finger. I have dipped 3 fingers of my right hand, thumb, forefinger, and middle finger. Our emphasis, Biragodiop, Verticum, lines 7 to 12. The idea of 3 fingers is given further clarification in thumb, forefinger, and middle fingers. 2. The great fall through the Adamic experience has earned man, among other things, sickness, death's harbinger. Death's harbinger, messenger of death, is in opposition to sickness. G. Metonymy. This is a figure of speech in which the poet substitutes the subject, profession, or person with an object closely associated with what is substituted. Example, the king can be substituted with the crown, the laborer with spade, writer with pen, soldier with gun, lady with skirt, etc. For example, the English actuary struck the French horses, Drayton, the Ballad of Agincourt. H. Synecdoche. This is a form of metaphor in which the poet uses a part to represent a whole of the referent. The choice of the part of referent must be the most important part if the synecdoche is to be effective. Example, 1. All hands are on deck, meaning everybody is at work. 2. We shall need more hands as the work progresses, meaning more people shall be needed as the work progresses. 3. Blind mouths that scare themselves know how to hold a sheep hook or have learned aught else the least. John Milton, Lycidas. I. Symbols, images, allegory. These are sometimes difficult to distinguish. The word image often suggests a mental picture, that is, something perceived in the mind's eye. An image, or on a more general note, is what it exactly is. 1. Symbols. A symbol is something other than what it states or shows. It operates on 2 levels, that which is the symbol and that which it represents. White, as in color, purity or innocence, or death, as in ghost or a shroud. Red, as in color, danger or sacrifice or victory, as in the blood of Jesus Christ. Green, as in color, a rich vegetation or naivety or ignorance or inexperience. Lamb, innocence, purity. Sheep, ignorance, foolishness, stupidity. 2. Allegory. An allegory is a narrative or descriptive poem which has a secondary or symbolic meaning besides the primary or literal meaning. The emphasis in this case is usually on the ulterior, symbolic or literary, secondary meaning. It is not common in short poems, but in long narrative poems. Example, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by S.T. Coleridge, Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, and Paradise Lost by John Milton. J. Oxymoron. It is a figure of speech in which a poet places 2 contrasting words side by side to suggest an idea that seems contradictory. Example, bittersweet, or as in Coleridge's The Nightmare, Life in Death, was she, the rime of the ancient mariner. K. Antithesis. It is a figure of speech in which a poet uses a sentence or a paragraph, words or ideas of expression that are contrasting. The difference between this and oxymoron is in the fact that while oxymoron involves contrasting words placed side by side, antithesis does not place contrasting words or ideas side by side. For example, 1. To live, you must die first. 2. What goes up must come down. L. Paradox. This can be likened to truth standing on its head. It is a strange truth. This strangeness resides in the statement's apparent contradiction, which contains some seminal truth when carefully analyzed. For example, 1. A child is the father of the man. 2. A child is a man in small letters. M. Understatement. It is a figure of speech in which the poet appears to say or state far less than he actually means, or where the poet chooses to say what he means with far less a force than expected. For example, the grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do their embrace. Andrew Marvell to his cove mistress. N. Hyperbole, exaggeration, overstatement. They all refer to a figure of speech in which the poet uses deliberate exaggeration without the intent of literal persuasion. A poet uses hyperbole with the aim of heightening effect. For example, had we but world enough and time, I would love you 10 years before the flood. Thine eyes and on thy forehead gaze, 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest, an age at least to every part, nor would I love at lower rate. Andrew Marvell to his coy mistress. O. Irony. It is a situation or a use of language involving some incongruity or discrepancy. There are different types of irony. This includes 1. Verbal irony. This is saying the opposite of what one means. 2. Dramatic irony. Here, the poet, playwright, implies a different meaning from that intended by the dramatis persona. 3. Irony of situation. This involves an incongruity between actual circumstances and those that seem appropriate and that which come to pass. What I have tried to explain through the different illustrations so far are some of the uses of the resources of language in poetry. Let us now consider how the poet exploits the resources of music. Summary of study session 1. In this study session, you have been introduced to the nature of poetry. Definitions have been provided. You have learned of the possible sources of poetry. You have also seen the distinguishing characteristics of poetry in terms of its resources of language such as imagery and figures of speech, and resources of music such as rhyme, rhythm, alliteration, and so on.
This is the end of study session 1. Thanks for listening.